Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities, a forum for the discussion of the issues that have a critical impact on our lives. The Center embodies the University of New England's commitment to public service and community enrichment. We are rightly known for our excellence in the health professions and medical programs, but as the Center demonstrates, we are equally committed to the humanities and a life of reflection and debate. The humanities are just as critical to public health and welfare as our professional disciplines. And so I was told to let you know that we are on Facebook now, and if you go to our website, you can find that Facebook address on it. This evening, I have the honor of introducing you to Ted Gup, who many of you already know, I'm sure, but a little bio wouldn't help, just to remind you of the many accomplishments many of his accomplishments. The title of the talk tonight is How the Great Depression Changed America, and it's basically based on his book, A Secret Gift, which was published last year, and it's on sale tonight, outside of this room. Ted Gup is the author of A Secret Gift and two previous books, Nation of Secrets, The Threat to Democracy and the American Way of Life, which was a winner of the Goldsmith Book Prize from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and the bestseller, The Book of Honor, Covert Lives and Classified Deaths at the CIA, which was published in 2000. He is a former investigative reporter for the Washington Post, working under Bob Woodward. He later wrote for Time magazine, covering Congress and the environment, and serving as Washington investigative correspondent. Since 2009, he has been professor and chair of the journalism department at Emerson College in Boston. From 1999 to 2009, he was the Shirley Wormser Professor of Journalism at Case Western Reserve University. Gup has also taught at Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. He has been an invited speaker at numerous venues, including Harvard, Columbia, Williams, Duke, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, among other places. The Asia Foundation, the National Archives, the European Fulbright Commission, the United Nations International School, the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Center for Public Integrity, etc. He has also been a guest on news programs, including those of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, PBS, and NPR. He has written for a wide range of publications, including the Smithsonian, National Geographic, the New York Times, Boston Globe, Village Voice, Sports Illustrated, Slate, GQ, Mother Jones, and a number of other publications. He has been a Pulitzer finalist in national reporting and recipient of the George Polk Award, the Worth Bingham Prize, the Gerald Lieb Award, the National Conservation Achievement Award, and the Book of the Year Award from investigative reporters and editors for his book, The Book of Honor. He has been a grantee of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a fellow of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a Thomas J. Watson Fellow, a Guggenheim Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar to China. Gup studied classics as an undergraduate at Brandeis and Trinity College, Dublin, and later studied law at Case Western Reserve University, becoming a member of the D.C. Bar. He and his wife, Peggy, live in Boston, Massachusetts, and Bucksport, Maine. They have two sons, David and Matthew. Please help me in welcoming Ted Gup.
How are you all this evening? Can you hear me okay? After that introduction, I'm feeling positively ancient. Sorry. Oh my. You're too generous, but boy, I do feel old hearing all of that. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be here this evening. It's an honor and a privilege, and there are a few people I want to thank in particular. President Daniel Ripich, who is a former colleague of mine about a decade ago, Anouar Majid, Director of the Center for Global Humanities and Associate Provost, and my sister, Audrey Gup, Director of Continuing Education and Summer Programs. I want to thank you for coming this evening. I have a story that I want to tell you. But before I get to my story, I want to relate it to what's happened in the last few years. My story is true. I feel compelled to say that these days. I'm not even going to give you the reference, and in fact, it seems as though there are an increasing number of references to the veracity of stories that are purporting to be nonfiction, but this one is nonfiction, and I have witnesses in the audience that can attest to it. But to state the obvious, we've been through a difficult time the last few years, and we all know that. And Maine has not been immune, and I doubt that there's a family in this room that has been immune from what we're calling the Great Recession, which was the greatest turndown in our economy since the Great Depression. Even now, today, when we speak about having come through it, there are a lot of Americans that don't feel that they've come through it at all. Tonight, we have about 14, 15 million Americans still out of work. And that is the number of Americans that were out of work in the Great Depression. The difference is that back then, it was about 25% of the U.S. population, and tonight, it's about 8.8%. But that's not a lot of comfort to the folks that can't find a job. Harry Truman was once asked to tell the difference between a recession and a depression, and his response was, "It's a recession when your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression when you lose yours." And I think that rings pretty true. These are difficult times, but they're not the hard times. The hard times, the ones that deserve a capital, the H and the T, they refer to the period that began with the stock market crash of '29 and stretched on for more than a decade. Historians may differ about exactly when the Great Depression ended. Some will go as late as the beginning of the Second World War. But however you count it, it was a long, cold, miserable decade. The period that I want to take you back to is the bottom of the Great Depression. I want to take you to the worst year of the Great Depression, and maybe the worst month of the worst year of the Great Depression. Why would you want to go there with me? Well, because you're safe, you're here, and this is just a story. But it goes back to December 33. And the place is west of here in Canton, Ohio, which is my hometown, an industrial town then, not today, but then. If you were to go back and visit it in 1933 in December, aside from it being cold, what you would see is a tremendous number of people out of work. Now, nobody knows the exact number, and the reason no one knows is because it wouldn't have mattered if you did know, because there was no help on the way. There was no New Deal at that point. The New Deal was just a glint in FDR's eye. So in my hometown, unemployment at that period was estimated to be 50%. That means half the people that were looking for work, needed work, couldn't find work. And if you went back to my hometown at that period, you would see a desolate environment. You would see along the railroad tracks where the B&O was, you would see kids in patched coats picking up coal that had fallen from passing trains. And they were gathering it in burlap bags and taking it home to heat the house that night. There was a guard there in the railroad yards, and his job was to make sure that the kids didn't reach up and take the coal off of the trains. So he was a big guy, and he would lean up with his arm up against the cars with the coal in it. But when he saw these kids scavenging for coal, he would take his hand and casually brush extra pieces onto the track so that they would have a little bit more to take home. And that was very typical of that period. Those acts of kindness, they were small, but they made a world of difference. I want to take you to a specific day, which is December 18th, a week before Christmas, 1933. On that day, an ad appeared in the Canton Repository, which is the local newspaper. It was a small ad, about the size of a deck of playing cards. It ran on the inside of the paper. And it basically reached out a hand to the community, and it said, essentially, write to me if you're going through a hard time, and I will help you in a modest way before Christmas. And the writer of this signed it B. Verdot and said in the ad, this is not my real name, you'll never know who I am, and no one will ever know who you are, those of you that write to me. It was such a significant offer that the paper ran a front-page story about it, accompanying the ad, and that meant everyone in the community read about it and saw it, and word of it spread for hundreds of miles. In fact, it was reported on in papers as far away as New York. Within a couple of days, hundreds, maybe thousands of letters poured in addressed to B. Verdot, and these people explained their situation and asked for help. And a couple of days later, 150 checks for $5 went out to 150 families in the community of Canton, Ohio. No one found out who this B. Verdot was or who had written to him. People speculated in the community. Some said it's a banker. Some said it's a Hoover or a Timken, someone related to the Diebold company. These were the large companies in town. But no one really knew. All they knew was that it was a good Christian. They knew that because the ad spoke of the Christian spirit, the spirit of Christmas and giving. And so in the years thereafter, people speculated about the identity of B. Verdot, but in time, prosperity returned to my hometown. The factories went back to work, many of the people went back to work, and the whole mystery of B. Verdot vanished. And that is where the story ends, but not quite. A couple of years ago, on my mother's 80th birthday, I drove from Bucksport, you know where that is, where we have a camp, down to Kennebunk, where my mother lives, to surprise her on her birthday. We met her at dinner, and afterwards she took us to her attic, my son and I, Matthew and I, and said, I have something for you. It's an old suitcase. Don't know what's in it, but whatever it is, you're welcome to it. Some old papers. And I took the old suitcase. It was a battered old black suitcase about this large, and I took it back up to the camp in Bucksport. And a couple days later, I opened it up, and I'll show you what I saw. Just bear with me 1 second. Inside were 150 letters, more than that actually, a couple of hundred letters, all of them dated December 1933, all of them addressed to B. Verdot. And along with those were 150 canceled checks, all of them signed B. Verdot. I had no idea what I was looking at. And I put it all away in the suitcase and slid it back under my bed. And a few days later, I pulled it out again. And this time, I found the front page story from the Canton Repository that described the gift. And I realized then that B. Verdot was my grandfather, Sam Stone. And the name B. Verdot was a combination of his three daughters, Barbara, Virginia, and Dorothy, known as Dotsy. Virginia is now sitting in the front row here, the Ver and B. Verdot. This is the Stone family, taken a year after the gift, 1934. And you can see Barbara, Virginia, and Dorothy, and Sam Stone and his wife, my grandmother, Minna Stone. This gift that went out to the 150 families, it was $5. Now, $5 doesn't sound like much, but back then, it was more like $100. A loaf of bread was 7 cents, a pound of ground beef 11 cents. The minimum wage recently passed was 33 cents. But most people considered themselves darn lucky if they made $1 a day. $5 was a fortune. Now, when I found this, and when I figured out what it was that I was looking at, I didn't think of it as a story. I didn't think of it as a book. I had not my author's hat on, but my grandson hat on. I was very proud of my grandfather, and I was very proud of my hometown, but I didn't think of writing about it, and that came considerably later. But when I did think about it, which was in October, when the American economy was cratering and people were talking about sinking into another Great Depression, then I decided that I would do two things. One, I would track down what happened to the people that he helped, their descendants, and see what became of them. Did the gift make a difference? Did they survive the Great Depression? Did they know greater prosperity in the years after? The other thing I decided to do was I wanted to try to figure out why my grandfather made this gift, because that was something of a mystery to me. I knew he was a generous man, but this was not something of which I was aware at all. So let me take the second question first, which is why he did this. Here's what I knew about him. He was a character. He was a true character. If you, those of you that have the book, you will see pictures of him in there. And they're not your typical picture of a grandfather. And one of them, he is in drag. Not because he was a transvestite, but because he was incredibly playful. And he just did it. Another one, he's 90 years old and standing on his head. I knew that he'd had a tough time of it growing up. He made no secret of that, and he shared that with me. He told me about working in a coal mine. He told me about washing soda bottles with an acid that ate at his fingertips. He told me about a number of what I would call traumatic events growing up. And he told me about that he was born in Pittsburgh and grew up there. And from Dotsie, my aunt, I got his birth certificate from Pittsburgh. I had his passports, which said that he was born in Pittsburgh. But as I sank into finding out who he was, what I discovered was that all of his documents were fraudulent. They were all bogus. He was not born in Pittsburgh, because I went to Pittsburgh and I looked at where the birth certificate came from, and the page in that book belonged to someone else. Okay? And all of the research I did into these documents proved to be a dead end. So then I began to look for him on ships' passenger lists, thinking that he was from out of country. And it took me a while, but I found him entering the country in 1902 as a refugee from Romanian pogroms. He was part of a group called the Fuzgaiers, which meant the footwalkers. He was Jewish, and in Romania in 1902, Jews were not allowed to own land, go to school, hold almost any kind of job. The idea was to starve them to death or drive them out of the country. And so he and his family had left by foot with rags on their back, rejected from country after country, finally coming to the United States, which was the only country that would have them, and let me just say, would have them reluctantly. Because Theodore Roosevelt, then the president, and his Secretary of State, John Hayes, literally said, that this was a pestilential stock that would be a burden on America for generations if we allowed them to come in. They were the least cultured, the least literate, the least wanted. And that may help explain why, when my grandfather got off the ship, not long after, he and his siblings changed their names and never again spoke of Romania. And why it is that I was the one that told my mother her father was born in Romania, not Pittsburgh. She never heard the word Romania mentioned in her house. So what does that have to do with this gift, that Christmas in Depression-era Canton, 1933? Well, think about the year, 1933. It was the year Hitler came to power. It was the year the first concentration camp opened. And no one understood better what that meant than my grandfather, having endured what he did in Romania. And so it's my belief that this gift, in part at least, is an expression of gratitude to be in a place where he was safe and where he was welcomed and where his family was welcomed. And I do think that that was a significant part of it. But it's amusing to think, after all the speculation of who Beaver Dot was, the good Christian, the wealthy scion of one of the industrialists in town, that the Secret Santa was an Orthodox Jew who spoke Yiddish and kept kosher when he got off the ship. Right? Now, what I want to do now is talk to you just a bit about the letters. Because the title of this talk is How the Great Depression Changed America. America was a very, very different place in 1933. And Americans were a very different people. Now, I want to say this without offending, insulting, or appearing to be partisan in any way, because these are very politically charged times. But there are a few things that I can say that I think are true. And one of them is that the people in this country in 1933 had no notion of entitlement. The word was not a part of their vocabulary. The idea that somehow the government owed them something, owed them anything, was completely alien to them. Completely alien. They were extraordinarily proud. They would not accept charity, by and large. And you can hear this in the letters. People who didn't work were called out of work or down and out or jobless. They weren't called unemployed. Unemployed is a kind of euphemism. And today we even speak of unemployment benefits as if there's some advantage to being unemployed. Believe me, in 1933, nothing could be further from the truth. So, I want to read to you now, or tell you about a couple of these letters, because I think that they will make the case of how different Americans were then and now. Before I do, here's one figure I want you to think about. Today, 1 in 7 Americans rely on food stamps. That's 43 million Americans. That is utterly inconceivable to the Americans of 1933. This is not a judgment about the need for or usefulness or value of food stamps. It's just a reality that in 1933, there was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, there was no Medicare, no Medicaid, no Social Security, there was no net. If you fell, the only thing that would catch you is the sidewalk. That's how it was back then. So the first person I want to tell you about is a fellow named George Monnet. George Monnet was an incredibly successful businessman. And he was so smart that 2 years after Henry Ford incorporated his Ford Motor Company, he started a dealership in Canton and quickly built it up into quite a remarkable enterprise. At one point, he had 1,200 cars, and his showroom took over an entire city block. And he had a summer home, he had a yacht, he was one of the founders of the country club. His wife, Alice, was one of the great socialites in town. I want to show you a picture of him because it's the picture of an aristocrat. That's George Monnet in good times. But in 1929, with the stock market crash, and he was overextended, he lost everything. Everything. And 4 years later, he had even less. So I want to read to you the letter that he wrote to Beaver Dot. And what's interesting, among other things, is that almost every letter, out of 150, I would say maybe 146 or 147, were written December 18th, 1933, which is to say they didn't even wait one day to respond to the offer. It's a sign of how desperate they were. The same day they saw it, they wrote. And this is George Monet's letter. Dear Sir, your interesting and benevolent article appearing in the repository prompted me to write and advise how the Depression left the writer. For 26 years was in the automobile business, prosperous at one time, and have done more than my share in giving at Christmas and at all times. Have a family of 6, and struggle is the word for me now for a living. Christmas will not mean much to our family this year, as my business, bank, real estate, insurance policies are all swept away. Our resources are nil at present. Perhaps my situation is no different than hundreds of others. However, a man who knows what it is to be up and down can fully appreciate the spirit of one who has gone through the same ordeal. You are to be congratulated for your benevolence and kind offer to those who have experienced this trouble and such as the writer is going through. No doubt you will have a happy Christmas, as there is more real happiness in giving and making someone else happy than receiving. May I extend to you a very happy Christmas. George Monet. The check for $5 arrived 2 days later, and George Monet responded with a thank you note. My dear Mr. Beaverdot, permit me to offer my sincere thanks for your kind remembrance for a happy Christmas. Indeed, this came in very handy and was much appreciated by myself and family. It was put to good use, paying for 2 pairs of shoes for my girls and other little necessities. I hope someday I have the pleasure of knowing to whom we are indebted for this very generous gift. At present, I am not of employment, and it is very hard going. However, I hope to make some connections soon. I again thank you on behalf of the family, and an earnest wish is that you have a most happy New Year. Sincerely yours, George W. Monet. And you can hear the dignity in that voice, and you can hear the pain of having written that letter. I want to tell you just a little bit about what happened to George Monet. Before I do, I want to say that my grandfather gave a promise that he would not reveal the identity of the letter writers. So I want you to know that all but one letter in my book is accompanied with a release by a descendant, a direct family member, saying I may publish that letter, because I did not want to violate the promise my grandfather made. And I will tell you about the one letter in a minute. I will read to you and try to explain why. So George Monet, unlike a Frank Capra film like It's a Wonderful Life, does not have a happy ending. He did not recuperate from the Great Depression. The only thing that he was able to salvage from his business was a huge chest of tools, and he would use it. Every night he would go down into the basement. He lost his house. He had a fine Tudor home in Canton, and he lost it and ended up in an apartment in an alleyway. Alice, the socialite, his wife, her friends never came to visit her. They completely cut her off. And it wasn't out of cruelty, I think. It was out of discomfort. They simply didn't know what to say to her because of her change in circumstance. But George Monet would go down each evening into the basement and work with his tools, trying to invent something that would lift up the family out of their poverty. It didn't happen. He ended up working as a clerk in a factory, and he passed away from pancreatic cancer at a relatively young age. There are 2 footnotes to the story. One is his showroom where the 1,200 cars were in downtown Canton. It went through many different incarnations. It was a factory store, it was all kinds of things over the years. But beginning about 20, 25 years ago, and by sheer luck or chance, that showroom became a museum for classic cars. And in the middle of it is a Model T Ford of the vintage that George Monet would have sold. And I kind of like to imagine him standing there at night by his vehicle. The other footnote is I interviewed his descendants, and one of them is a gentleman named Jeffrey. And Jeffrey enjoys the good life that George Monnet did before his change of circumstance. And it was to Jeffrey that the tool chest passed. Jeffrey has a home on a golf course in England. He has a home in Oregon, a home in South Carolina. He collects ancient Greek and Roman coins, and he drives a Porsche and a Mercedes, but no Ford. And so he enjoys the good life. And that is just a glimpse of George Monnet. And now I want to tell you about the Bailey family. But before I do, I just want to say that some of you may be of an age to remember the Depression. One of the characteristics of the Depression is that people were frequently, if not constantly, on the move because they couldn't afford the rent or they couldn't afford the mortgage payments. And so they were evicted over and over and over again. And one of the things that's emblazoned on the memory of anyone that grew up in one of these families is the memory of constant moving, the rootlessness of it. And that's what the Bailey family experienced. They had many children, and that's the other thing to remember, that in those days, people didn't just have 2, 3, 4 children. They would have 6, 7, 8, 9 children, and that meant a world of difference. So this is a letter that Ida Bailey wrote to Beaver Dot. Mr. Beaver Dot, kind friend. This Christmas is not going to be a merry one for us, but we are trying to make the best we can of it. We want to do all we can to make the children happy, but can't do much. About 7 years ago, Mr. Bailey lost his health, and it has been nip and tuck ever since, but we thank God he is able to work again. We all work when we can make a nickel honest. 3 years ago, this depression hit us, and we lost all our furniture and had to separate with our children. We have 4 of them with us again. There are 3 girls working for their clothes and board. I do wish I could have all my children with me once again. This was the other great phenomenon of the Depression, is that so many children found their way into orphanages because the parents had a very difficult decision. They could hold on to their children, but then they couldn't feed them, or they would part with them, but know that they would at least be provided for at some basic level. So this is the story of Ida Bailey, but it's not Ida's story that I want to tell you about. It's Denzil Bailey, who was one of their 9 children. And by the time that he was in the 6th grade, he had moved 28 times. He had been to every school in the city of Canton at least once, and in most cases 3 times. He barely had time to unpack his suitcase. He had no time to make friends, no time to complete a course or get credit. And by the 6th grade, he just could see the futility of it. And he dropped out of school and became a janitor, worked in the school. And in time, he met a woman that had a background similar to his, which is not so rare in those days. Denzil Bailey was not an extreme case. They fell in love and they married. And Denzil Bailey made a pact with himself. He basically said, my children will never be forced to move. My children will live in one house and one house only, go to one school and one school only, and they will never endure what I endured. And to make good on that pact with himself and with his family, he decided he would build his own house. And he would build it of the most lasting thing that he knew, which was stone. Now, he was not a mason. He was not particularly adept at stoneworking. But he set about to build a house for his family. And so he went to quarries and gathered stone. He went to buildings that had burned down, old one-room schoolhouses. And he brought the stone back to this yard, and he started to build a house. This was not an ambitious or large house. It was 1,000 square feet. And he worked on it with his eldest son, and it took him a year, and then another year, and another year, and then in the end it took him 30 years. And over the course of building this house, everyone in the community knew about his effort and knew what he was striving to do. And they tried to contribute. By that I mean that wherever they went, they would come back and bring him a stone as a token of their support. So one of the people that brought him a stone was his minister, who, when he was in the Holy Land, brought back a stone, which found its way next to the doorway of the house. Another neighbor went to Egypt and brought back a stone from the base of the pyramids. Wherever people went, they brought back stones, and Denzil Bailey always found room for them in this house. His children never had to move, never went to more than the one school, and when Denzil Bailey's health was failing, he knew he wanted to die in this house, and so they set up a bed for him in the living room with his children around him, and that's where he passed away, in his house. That house is still around, it still stands, and today it is owned by his son. And that's the story of Denzil Bailey. I have just 3 more stories I want to share with you, and then what I'd like to do is open it up, because I'd like to hear from you. This story is not a story at all, it's a life, and you have to remember that sometimes. This is about Howard Summers, and this is the one individual from whom I did not get permission, and I'll try to explain why after I read the letter. I'm not going to read the whole letter, but I'll read a portion of it. Dear friend Beaver Dot. Now, many of the people in this period could not afford a newspaper. It cost a penny. And they would share it. They'd pass it around house to house, and you'll hear that in the letters. Dear friend Beaver Dot, as I picked up the evening paper, I saw your most generous offer to worthy people. I count myself and my wife most worthy. As for the last 4 years, I have only had a few days' work here and there. But I will go ahead and state the jobs my wife and I have had to do before we would ask for charity. Picking berries in season and selling them as late as 12 o'clock at night. Picking cherries on the share and selling our share. My wife had to climb to the tops of the highest trees, as I am lame and cannot climb. We have started as early as February to gather dandelions. Dandelions were a very common dinner in the Great Depression. We have started as early as February to gather dandelions to sell, and sold them till May, or till people would not buy them any longer, as they were too tough to eat. Our wintertime job is gathering sassafras, which is a lot of hard work and not much money in it. The last 6 or 8 months I have been selling liquid solder, pills and sturdy pencils in and about Canton, for about 10 miles around at nearby towns. But I found that selling house to house is a hard job, as scarce as money was. As far as clothes is concerned, I have had to buy a few things for myself, as I had to meet the public. But my wife has not had a coat in 7 years, and her last pair of shoes were bought in 1929. The coat is not fit to wear. And it ends, after you have read it over, well, I think this is enough said, but I could sit here and write for hours, but 3 pages is enough. After you have read it over, and you are the judge, and you don't feel that we are worthy of your donation, secretly, as you promised then, please destroy this letter so no one will know but you and I. So goodbye and good luck. And we are living in hopes that good luck comes our way. Mr. and Mrs. Howard Summers. Well, he did not destroy the letter, obviously. Howard Summers also did not recover from the Great Depression. His wife predeceased him. She died at a particularly young age. He died not long thereafter, and they had no children. I found the obituary, and the bloodline ended there. I made the decision unilaterally, and you may disagree with it, especially given his express instructions to destroy the letter. But the fact is that the only thing that exists, that is left of Howard Summers and his wife, is this letter. It's the only thing in this world that is left. And I felt that it gave some meaning to what he had suffered by preserving it and making it part of this book. I did not have him to consult, nor his wife. And I had some conflict within myself about what to do with it. But the other thing I should tell you, you could hear the exhaustion in his voice in this letter. When he wrote it, he was 28 years old. Two more. This is the life of Edith May. And Edith May lived on a farm outside of Canton. And she wasn't sure whether she would qualify for this gift because she wasn't properly in the city limits. And she complained about the cold. She could feel the cold. She was 39 years old when she wrote Beaver Dot. Again, December 18th, the same day the ad appeared. Mr. Beaver Dot, maybe I shouldn't write to you, not living right in Canton, but for some time I've been wanting to know somebody who could give me some help. We have known better days. 4 years ago, we were getting $135 a month for milk. They sold milk on the farm. Now Saturday, we got 12. This 12 has to go as follows. Pay for the gas to haul the milk, get chopping, pay for coal, during the cold spell, buy an axe to make wood, buy a tire for $1, and I had $2 to buy groceries. Imagine 5 of us for a month. If I only had $5, I would think I am in heaven. I would buy a pair of shoes for my oldest boy in school. His toes are all out, and no way to give him a pair. He was just 6 in October. Then I have a little girl, will be 4, 2 days before Christmas, and a boy of 18 months. I could give them all something for Christmas, and I would be very happy. Up to now, I haven't a thing for them. Now, I'm not going to read you the whole letter, but I do have to read you the last 2 paragraphs. And oh my, I know what it is to be hungry and cold. We suffered so last winter, and this one is worse. Please do help me. My husband don't know I am writing, and I haven't even a stamp, but I am going to beg the mailman to post this for me. Obligingly, Mrs. Edith May. And that letter was delivered without a stamp. It was in the suitcase that I showed you. Edith May felt the cold. She was Jamaican. She was black and Jamaican and had been a governess for a prosperous family in Jamaica and had struck up a pen pal relationship with the grandson of an American slave, and they fell in love through the mail. And this gentleman from the United States went over to Jamaica. They met, and indeed they were in love, and he brought her back to this farm outside of Canton, Ohio, where they made a living. There are 2 stories that I want to share with you about her. They come from her daughter, Felice May. The first is, Felice told me that skunk was the smell of money in her family, which meant that her father, to get through the hardest of times, trapped skunk and sold the pelts. And she told me that in her house, she knew, and her mother knew, when he'd been successful even before he got home. But it was very difficult work. And on at least one occasion, and probably more, he arrived with blinded, his eyes swollen shut because he was sprayed directly in the face. And his wife was there with a pail of water and wiped his eyes clear so that he could see. And that was one of the stories that Felice told me. The other one was that in her childhood, they never left the farm for Christmas. They never saw the Christmas lights. They did the chores, they went to bed, and that was it. Her birthday was 2 days before Christmas. And she had no store-bought toys. And there was not a lot of gaiety in her life growing up. She only remembers one birthday where they left the farm after doing the chores. They went into town, to Canton, and they saw the Christmas lights. And she was bedazzled. She'd never seen anything like that before. And her mother took her to the back of a 5 and dime store, to the toy section, and said, Felice, you can have a dolly or you can have a wooden horse. The wooden horse had a pull string, and it had wheels underneath it. It was on a little platform. And Felice chose the wooden horse, and it was her favorite toy as a child. Indeed, it was her only store-bought toy, and she would pull it all over the farm. And in the course of our conversation, she said, that was my 4th birthday. She said, you know, I never understood how it was that in the depth of those hard times, my mother and father could have afforded to take me into town and buy me that horse. And now I understand. I was 4 in 1933. It was your grandfather's gift. And one final footnote about that. Felice May today raises miniature ponies. Now, the last story I want to tell you is the story of Helen Pom. I have to smile, and you'll understand why in a minute. So I'm a pretty good reporter. I'm persistent as could be. I don't give up easily. And I'd gone through all the letters trying to find the descendants, and I had succeeded in all but one case. And time was moving on. My book was due. It had to be at the copy desk to be copy edited. And I was holding out because I still had not found a descendant for Helen Pom. And at a certain point, my editor said, time. And I don't like to miss deadlines, so I turned in the book, and it was edited, and it was done. And that gave me a little breathing space, and I had a spare afternoon, and I said, I'm going to make one more run trying to find a descendant for Helen Pom. And after a couple of hours of work, and with some help from a genealogist in Canton, and finding an obituary, I found her daughter, Janet. And it was eureka. You know, I just felt great. I have this expression that I say as a journalist, that God rewards those who make a call after the last call. And this was my call after the last call. So I was interviewing Judith, and I was asking her the same questions I asked all the other descendants about the letter writer, her mother. I asked her when she was born and where she grew up and when she married. And I was about to ask her when she passed, and she said, would you like to speak with her? Yes, exactly. You could have knocked me off my chair with a feather. 149 of the letter writers were deceased. One was alive, and I had found her, Helen Pom. And so an hour later, I was talking with Helen Pom. And I want to read you her note. Dear Sir, when we went over at the neighbors to borrow the paper, remember I told you they couldn't afford to own it, to borrow the paper, I read your article. I am a girl of 14. I am writing this because I need clothing, and sometimes we run out of food. My father does not want to ask for charity, but us children would like to have some clothing for Christmas. When he had a job, us children used to have nice things. I also have brothers and sisters. If you should send me the money, I would buy clothing and buy the Christmas dinner and supper. I thank you, Helen Pom. And she said, oh my God, She's 92. She wrote that when she was 14. And I asked her, do you remember how you spent the money? And she went right back to being a 14-year-old, and she said, gee whiz, you bet. And you'll understand why she remembered, because the first thing she did, she had shoes that had so many holes in them. And you know, December in Ohio is both wet and cold. And she had taken a box of shredded wheat, an empty box, and cut out the shape of the soles of her feet from the cardboard in the box and put it under her feet to help keep out the cold and the wet. So the first thing she did is she went out and she got herself a pair of shoes. And then she got an item of clothing for a brother and sister. And then, all this on $5, she took her mother and father out to a show and dinner. And that was how she spent the money. And of all of the 150 recipients of the gifts, she and she alone lived long enough to know the identity of Beaver Dot. And when I told her who it was, Sam Stone, and Sam Stone, how did he afford this? He had a clothing store in downtown Canton called Stone's Clothes. And when she found out who it was, she said, that little man? And she knew who it was because she and her father in better times had gone in there to pick out a tie. And she said, God bless him. He must be very proud, she said. And I was. So now I want to bring you up to date. This will just take a minute, and then we'll open it up because I'd like to know what you're thinking about and what's on your mind. There are a number of things that have happened. A month before the book came out, I decided I wanted to say thank you to the families for entrusting me with their stories. And so I decided that I would have a banquet for at least 2 or 3 members of each family at an old German tavern that their parents had gone to in Canton called Bender's. It was opened in 1902. And I wanted to bring together as many of the descendants around the country as I could to the Palace Theater, which was built in 1926. Their parents used to escape the Great Depression with a nickel matinee there. And so my mother orchestrated this, sent out the invitations, and we sent out invitations across the land to the descendants of the letter writers and to the descendants of Beaver Dot. And on the evening of November 5th, 2010, they gathered at the Palace Theater, somewhere between 400 and 600 people. And we had some of them come up on stage and read from their letters. The oldest was Betty Snively. She was 97. Helen Pom read her own letter. She was the only one that could do that, obviously. It was an extraordinary evening, and it was billed as an evening to remember, and it was that. There was a composer who had contacted me about writing music about this story using the words of the letters as lyrics. And he was a well-established composer, and he had a group of 6 classically trained musicians. And they were to fly into Canton and be on stage. And after the people read the letters, they would perform the music using the lyrics. They were not receiving a fee, and they were to pay their own way coming to Canton. I helped them a little bit. The day before they were to leave from Utah, the composer, Philip Bimstein, received a letter in the mail, and inside was a check and a note. And the note said, this check is to help pay for your trip to Canton, Ohio. Please give my regards to my grandson, Ted Gup, signed Beaver Dot. And the check was drawn on a Utah bank, and we still don't know who sent it. This gathering of descendants was a critical moment, event in the history of my town and the people there. It was a really big deal. And a few days later, 3 prominent businessmen in Canton got together and decided they would duplicate the gift to Beaver Dot. And they would do so anonymously. And they took out an offer in the Canton Repository and invited the needy, because my hometown is on hard times again, and said, write to us using the name Beaver Dot, and we will help you before Christmas. And they adjusted the gift for inflation from $5 to $100, so it was $15,000. And their example so moved the community that more than 200 other citizens came forward, and the amount swelled to $54,000, and 500 families were helped this last Christmas. And they have already pledged to do the same again next year. The event in the Palace Theater was filmed. It aired on CBS Sunday Morning, CBS Evening News. It was reported on Voice of America, National Public Radio. The book is now being translated. It's been published in South Korea and Korean. It's being translated in Italian, published in Italy, Mandarin, People's Republic of China, and Taiwan. It's been published in Australia. Not bad for a $5 gift in a small Midwest town, and one individual's giving. I want to say just one other thing, which is that this was not just a gift of my grandfather, Sam Stone. It was also a gift of my grandmother, his wife, Minna. And if you look at the checks, they all have beautiful penmanship with the name Beaver Dot. My grandfather didn't get past the second grade and could not write cursively. That was my grandmother's penmanship, her signature. And knowing her as I do, I know she was instrumental in helping my grandfather with this gift. So that's really all that I have to say, but I'm very eager to hear what is on your minds. Please. Do we have any? Oh my goodness, please, 1 second. I want to show you a picture of Helen Pom. Then and now.
Hello? Okay. Hi, please make sure to ask your questions in a microphone, please.
Please.
Thank you so much. This is very inspiring and uplifting and interesting from a historic view. How did your grandfather weather the Depression himself? Obviously, he must have done okay, but how was it for his family?
Frankly, they didn't suffer. They did not suffer. There was one point where they had a setback, where they had to vacate a very nice house that they had and move into a much more modest house. And it was a bit of an adjustment. I don't think it lasted more than a year or two max. So none of the kinds of hardship that I'm describing were visited upon him. He did not have to endure that. But I'll tell you, he paid his dues before that. The first 30 years, he paid his dues. And my grandmother also had experienced, I won't say hardship, but she graduated from high school at 15 and had to graduate from high school at 15 to help support her family. Her father was a veteran of the Spanish-American War who suffered from malaria. And so I wouldn't say it was a totally easy time for her either. So they were both very empathetic and sympathetic to what was going on around them.
You know, I think the thing that intrigued me about your book was that there was no sense of entitlement. So in your perspective as a historian and a writer, how did we go from that sense of a culture where you're not entitled to everything to a culture now where everyone feels like they're entitled to have their right? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Do you have a shovel so I can dig my grave here? Yeah, I do. You know, I'm kind of hard to fix politically because there are parts of me that are very liberal and there are parts of me that are not very liberal. the period that I'm writing about here was a quintessential moment in American history. It was the moment at which personal pride, which was fused with integrity, gave way to a realization that no matter how resourceful you were and industrious and persistent, there were limits to what individuals could accomplish. That it had nothing to do with sloth, that one couldn't find a job. The system didn't work. It had failed them. And so the country had to make a decision whether humanity would trump individual pride. That was what the New Deal was about. And this week, writ large across the country, opened the door, not just for the New Deal, but for a kind of covenant between the people and the government that we would not allow our neighbors to suffer unduly if we could do something about it. And I think that was the origin of what we call entitlements. At a certain point, I think that notion, that mentality, down through a couple succeeding generations changed. And there was a presumptuousness that crept in. I think that the New Deal and what it brought in was essential. And if we had not done so, it would have been unconscionable as a nation. But I think that there is at least one generation, maybe two of us now, who are not cognizant of the kind of sacrifices and hardship that our grandparents and parents endured. And I hate to say this, but maybe are not made of sterner stuff. That they might be not willing to do the kinds of work that our grandparents did in order to keep food on the table and such. It's a different kind of pride, and that's not necessarily a healthy pride. That's just my own personal view.
I have one question for you. There is, I believe, sociological evidence that the group of individuals who either went into high school or attempted to enter the job market during the Depression became quite different after World War II. A very conservative, very non-risk-taking, successful generally, but not very outstanding group. We now, I think, almost for the first time since World War II, are facing not a whole generation, but a group of individuals, young people, who are facing a job market not that bad, but nonetheless very difficult, where many of them will face at least a few years where they will not have work. They will not starve, of course. You've already pointed that out. But I wonder if you think that this will have any effect on this generation comparable to what happened to those who came out in the Depression.
I have a son who's 20 and I have a son who's 21. And I worry about them a lot. Because they're going to be entering that job market with or without college degrees. One of them lives in Ohio, where the economy is decimated. The other lives in Tennessee. Economy's not great, but it's better than in Ohio. Are you asking me if they're going to learn something from this? Is that your question? That
Well, the question really is whether they will end up being different people than those who had the same position 5 or 10 years ago.
I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't know. I mean, a part of their necessities are iPads and iPhones and things that are so alien to the mindset of previous generations. I don't know what it'll take to dislodge that level of presumptuousness. I really don't know. I'm kind of hoping that it does have an effect on my sons and on that generation. I mean, I grew up not wanting for anything. I had everything that I needed. But one of the things I grew up with was a work ethic, and I was never afraid to work. I washed dishes, I worked at Jackhammer, I worked in the Combat Zone of Boston, a dress factory. I'd take a job, and I hope that kind of spirit is a part of this generation as well. It's hard to teach when you grow up in comfort. I mean, in many ways, I think our greatest enemy was prolonged prosperity, because I think it kind of diluted, I want to be careful here. I don't think it gave us a kind of steely character that we associate with the greatest generation. And so I don't wish adversity upon anyone, but I'd sure like to see some character in everyone, and I would like to see, I teach and I have students, and most of them are willing to work, but they're a little selective about what work they're willing to take, and so I do worry about that.
Hi. One of the things that was really very apparent in the letters as I read the book was that, by and large, most of the letters had to do with not asking for themselves, but for asking for their children. And so it's often our children that motivate us to do more than we would normally do. And I think that really resonated in your book. And I think because the times I grew up with my mother was a child during the Depression, and she had to work very hard to raise 5 children by herself, is that with each generation, you want your children to have a little bit more than you had. And, one of the things that we hoped after my husband and I each read your book, was to give it as gifts at Christmas time to relatives and, family, friends. And our hope is that as people read your book, that they realize that they can do small things that will help people around them. They don't have to just send a gift to Haiti, which
Right.
is admirable and we should do, or to Japan. But there's people in our neighborhoods that won't ask for help, that could use a little bit extra. So, in that, I really applaud you for telling your grandfather's story, because I think it does remind us that there's people all around us in our communities that can benefit from small gifts of kindness.
Right.
So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I do think that one of the effects of the Great Recession is at least that there's a bit of a reminder. It's kind of sobering, but it does remind you that we have a responsibility to each other. We live just outside of Cleveland, and in the year before we moved, Cleveland was decimated. I mean, foreclosures, you name it. And the public libraries of the city of Cleveland made an offer to the community that instead of paying off your fines for overdue books, you bring in canned goods for the needy, because the food bank couldn't keep up with the need. And that was a sign of where the community was. The house across the street from us was vacant for 2 years, foreclosed on. Lovely family had to move. So I think that that kind of really kind of self-centered, aggressive acquisition mode that characterized a lot of years, I think at least it was dealt a temporary setback, and if so, that's not so bad. In exchange for a greater sense of community, I don't think that would be a bad thing. So.
There we go. I was saying my stepfather's 102 and my mom is 86, and we're going to be together. They're flying to South Carolina for Easter from Ohio. I mean, this is certainly, they have memories of this period. And the thing that I think is interesting with my grandchildren, so it would be great-great-grandchildren from this generation, my grandson said, Nana and Jake live lightly on the earth, don't they? And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, they fold the wrapping paper at Christmas and they put it in the drawer and they do, all of those things. And this 9-year-old is picking up on it. He's saying they're really good to the environment. And I think that's the other thing that this sort of consumer lifestyle that we live in, it's really striking to these kids when they see the difference, and those are habits of a lifetime and of that generation. I think so. It's those acts of kindness that you talked about that we can do for each other. But I think the other thing is they really model a way of living on this earth that's really very special too. And I also am wanting to give this as gifts. I think it's a beautiful story and really speaks to Midwest values in my home. So thank you.
I like that Midwest values thing. I have to say, but I don't think it's just Midwest. But you know, I'm not trying to promote my book in any way. I don't care how the generation gets the lesson. One of the things was a great source of pleasure to me. I gave a talk about this book at a church in Biddeford Pool before it even came out, a couple months before. And the first woman that came afterwards, there was someone there taking advanced orders on the book. I hadn't sold any books yet. It hadn't come out. It wasn't going to come out for a month. And the first woman that came up to buy the book, I said, "You're the first person to buy this book in the entire country. I'm paying for it." So I picked up the tab on that. But the second person was a grandfather, and he bought 5 copies for his grandchildren. And I thought, that's what I want. That's what I want. It's funny because for the elderly, the book brings back memories. But for the young, it informs them of who their grandparents are and why they are the way they are. Because I've gotten hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails. And one of the most common themes is, I finally understand why my grandparents are the way they are. You know, these are written by people in their 20s, 30s, 40s. And until they understood what that period was like for their grandparents, they didn't really understand the habits of their grandparents, the view of life, the ethic of conservation and waste not, want not, and all of that. So,
Hi. One of the things that I'm thinking about is the fact that there's a large or a small group of people who seem to be intensely greedy. I mean, I have children the same age as yours, and we're sort of putting into this group, oh, these kids seem too overprivileged. But if you look at the people who caused this recession and their intense need for just inhumane amounts of money, then I wonder who's really setting the standard. I'm sure there are people who are multimillionaires who are making donations and doing acts of kindness, but it doesn't look like it from the perspective of those of us who don't have that kind of money and see that greed and see the massive bonuses. So what I'm wondering is whether or not what our kids are seeing is that. And I mean, it's wonderful that maybe they can look past that to see the people who really overcame this adversity. But I just see this massive globe in the sky that they're trying to achieve, and so these are the people who I really hold accountable for the times, for our kids' times, the hedge fund operators, the bank owners, the ones who are, who really seemed to know what was going on and not only did nothing about it, but figured out ways to make more money off of it.
I'm going to go out on a limb. Are you not voting for Donald Trump for president?
It's a pretty risky question there.
You know,
Thanks.
My wife has an expression which is, life isn't fair. And my God, I'm persuaded that she's right. The idea that we passed through those years that we just passed through and nobody went to jail, and that people like the head of Countrywide get fined something like $20 or $30 million and walked away with $600 million, there's something wrong with that. And you know, I don't pretend to understand what the dynamics of that are, but it has to do, I mean, our people, our citizenry, are the ones that determine what the response to that kind of thing is. I mean, it's in our hands. If we were really upset about it as a people, then there would be politicians who would carry out our mandate. and there would be prosecutions for fraud and all the manipulation that created that. Now, one last thing, we could all be indicted a little bit. That is, we participated in the fraud to some degree. We all thought home ownership is just a Roman candle going up and up and up in value, and you know, there were a lot of ways in which I think we were complicit in buying into this notion, and but I really do hope that there's, and this is not a Republican thing to say, but I really do hope that there's greater regulation of the financial markets and the banks, and that we go back to less speculation and less creativity in creating financial instruments like the collateralized debt obligations, the bundled mortgage stuff that was unappraisable. And I worry too, because the press is less aggressive now because its ranks have been thinned because of the economy. So there are fewer people watching, and that makes us more vulnerable. So yeah, I'm concerned about that. I do, you know, in this weird way, I do kind of think that life is kind of morality play, and you get your just comeuppance to some degree, and not just individually, but as a society. So, you know, if we're really concerned about it, we ought to do something about it.
We have a question from Paris.
From where?
From Paris, France.
I love it.
In your opinion, did the Great Depression affect the rest? Oops. In your opinion, did the Great Depression affect the rest of the world or other countries? Suad El Tayyib, Paris, France.
Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? This is, you know, that's why you got to love technology, right there, really. Well, it was a worldwide. You were talking about the Depression or the Recession? The Depression? Oh, the Great Depression was worldwide. I mean, that was absolutely worldwide. And by the way, so was the Great Recession. And the world has only gotten more global that way. We're more interdependent, not less. So, but yeah, the Great Depression had a devastating effect on countries around the world. So, yeah. Take one more question if there is one, please. Oh, there are two more. And that, yeah, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Gup. I really enjoyed your talk. And I want to say thank you to your mother for giving you the suitcase.
Yeah, I agree.
It makes me think about the scraps of paper I have from my father, of course, and who talked, and I'm not a reporter. I wish I'd asked the follow-up questions. When he graduated from high school in 1934, he got into a car in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and drove his mother to Los Angeles. I still don't know why he drove his mother. His father was gone off somewhere, and he talked about the adventures along the way and cutting out the card. There was the cardboard for the shoes and the newspaper for the tires, and the AAA directions. And I'd like to see a triptych from 1934, and it just brings back how precious these stories are, and that we have to keep listening to them and collecting them, and waste not, want not, and use it up and wear it out. And I've got a lot of that in me still, and it's irritating to my children, but not all of them. One of whom, I got an iPad this week myself as a reward for long service on my job, and my son called me and said, your book should be the first thing I download on it and read. So it all comes full circle. I said, but gee, how can you get an autograph on a downloaded book? But that's another story. So thank you very much, and that photograph is just priceless. So thank you for sharing these stories and reminding us how important these stories are.
Well, you remind me of something, which is that none of us are going to be around forever. So if you are interested in history and family history, yesterday was the time to get it, and today is certainly the time to get it. So, you know, if you have someone that you want to interview, film, take in video, slides, whatever, tape record, audio, you know, collect letters, now is the time to do it. I cannot tell you how many times I hear people say, you know, my grandmother, my great-grandmother had an incredible life, an incredible story. Oh, how I wish I had sat down with her and interviewed her, talked to her, tape recorded. You know, this is the time to do it. And every one of you sitting here has an incredible story behind you. You may or may not know it, but you do. There is not a soul that passes through this mortal coil that doesn't have a remarkable story to tell. And you know, you really should collect them because otherwise they vanish, you know? So there was another, please.
Yeah, have heard my grandmother tell of things that she did as they were not hurt by the Depression. My mother's family was different. But is that something in researching it that you came across, that in other towns there were other acts of, kind of random acts of kindness?
Yeah.
And it was general at that point of time?
Right. The beauty of this story, and I should have said it, is that it's not unique. The particulars of it may be unique, but the impulse behind it and the act to help others is in no way unique. All across this country through this period, there were untold acts of kindness done anonymously. Every town, money disappeared, so everything was by barter. People exchanged one skill for another. That's how it worked. You know, if you were a cobbler, you could fix the grocer's shoes in exchange for some groceries that week. And that's how this country stayed afloat for a decade, through the 30s. And there are remarkable stories. Undertakers buried people in exchange for God knows what services from the families. Babies were delivered without any money being received. Doctors routinely cared for people that couldn't pay. They knew they couldn't pay. Some of those doctors eventually lost their homes because they couldn't make the mortgage or they couldn't make the rent. And everywhere there are these stories. The dairyman, I mean, in my hometown, the fellow that delivered the milk, he would never cut off the milk to families that had infants or young children, ever. And so he delivered it knowing he wouldn't get paid. And he told me, the son told me, that some of those bills were paid 20 and 25 years later by the descendants, but they were paid. But they would not leave infants or young children without milk because they knew it was important. That was the mindset of the era. It really was. And so it wasn't just my grandfather, and it wasn't just Canton, Ohio. You know, if you knew, I promise you, every town of the size of Canton and larger across this country had not one person, but many, many people putting in tireless hours and what money they had and what energies they had to help each other. And almost all of them are unsung and forgotten because they were done anonymously. This was considered the right thing to do. And people did it everywhere. So, anyhow, I thank you all very much.